The Battle of the Atlantic. Introduction. World War II lasted for about 6 years. It lasted from 1939 to 1945. The war was between two sides, the Axis powers and the Allied powers. The Axis powers were made up of 3 countries: Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Allied powers were made up of 6 countries: the United States, Britain, Canada, France, China, and Russia or the Soviet Union. While the World War II was going on, the Allied powers were fighting against the Germans for control of the Atlantic Ocean. Here are 10 major events that happened during the Battle of the Atlantic. September 3rd, 1939. The Battle of the Atlantic started right after the British declared war on the Germans. The Germans decided to use one of their submarines off the coast of Ireland to torpedo a passenger ship which was headed to Montreal. This, in of itself, started the Battle of the Atlantic. The difficulties of the Allied powers. The Allied powers had convoys that had supplies on them. Those convoys were headed to different countries, but every time they went, the German submarines would sink them. The struggle got worse for the Allied powers, and in autumn of 1942, more than 2,000 merchant ships were lost. So were all the supplies, and thousands of men died. The Germans had an excellent strategy. They said that if they cut out the supplies that the Allies were bringing to other countries, then they could win the war. The Black Pit. The North Atlantic Ocean was becoming very dangerous to the Allied powers. The Germans will always sink their convoys, and there was so much death and destruction that the Allies did not know what to do. They ended up calling the Mid-Atlantic Range the Black Pit, because this is where most of their convoys were lost. St. Lawrence Gulf. In May of 1942, the Germans were winning. They became so great that they ended up using U-boats to enter the Gulf of St. Lawrence. There, they sank 21 ships of the British. The British were starting to lose, and they did not know what they could do. However, they had a plan. The introduction of planes and anti-submarine ships. In 1943, the British were able to turn the tide around by building long-range planes and anti-submarine ships. These long-range planes were able to guide the convoys through the destruction and damage that the Germans were doing. And the anti-submarine ships were used to fight back the Germans. Because of this, the Germans were able to sink fewer ships, and the British were starting to come back. The Coded Message. In 1940, the first British censorettes arrived. They were young English women trained to sift through mail. Their job was to search for secrets being passed to Germany, coded messages, invisible ink, and blacklisted addresses. they were able to open and reseal mail without a trace. Suspicious letters were kept in Bermuda. The capture of U-505. In 1944, American warships captured a German U-boat, U-545. This German U-boat was responsible for sinking hundreds of Allied ships. The code machines were brought to Bermuda under strict secrecy. These codes helped the Allies eventually win the war. The sinking of HMCS Esquimalt. On April 16, 1945, HMCS Esquimalt was torpedoed by U-190. The HMCS Esquimalt was a Bangor-class minesweeper that served in the Royal Canadian Navy during the Second World War. The U-190 was a German submarine. It was a Type IXC-40 U-boat of Nazi Germany. The U-190 struck Esquimalt's starboard side engine room, with the explosion knocking out all the power on board instantly, preventing anyone from giving signals to the Allies. Unfortunately, 44 of the Allies died. The surrender of the Germans. In early May of 1945, the Allied powers received a letter from the Germans. The Germans had surrendered. The war was finally over, and the Allied powers had won. However, even though the Allied powers had won, there were still some great losses. In all, 2,000 military men had died, 1,600 merchant convoys had been destroyed, and 752 Air Force members had died as well. The celebration and the remembrance. On May 8th, Bermuda celebrated its victory over the Germans in World War II. Hundreds of troops took part in a victory parade down Front Street. They included members of the Royal Navy, U.S. Navy, Army and Marine Corps, Canadian Forces, and the Royal Air Force. And even though some men died, their names are still written on the Halifax Sailors Memorial, and every year on the first Sunday in May, there is a small remembrance and celebration for the work that the troops had done for their win in World War II. World War II lasted for about 68 months. During that time, there were many major events, including the Battle of the Atlantic, Adolf Hitler's death, and many others that happened during World War II. World War II was a great war, one that practically changed the world forever. Hopefully there is not a World War III, and hopefully we are all safe and protected from what is to come.